Hello, everyone. This is Lindsay Robinson from the California Cannabis Industry Association. We are hosting our federal webinar today, starting in just a couple of minutes with our friends from the liaison group. So thank you, everyone, for joining. I know a lot of folks are still logging on, so we'll give it a minute before we get into the substance of the webinar. But do want to note that Safira, David, and I all have access to the microphone, but none of you do, unfortunately. We're expecting a pretty large crowd today. So if you would like to ask questions, which we do encourage, and we're leaving a portion of the webinar open for Q&A at the end, feel free to use the chat function, and those questions will come directly to me. I'm going to help moderate the conversation today. So please ask questions throughout, and then we'll get to them, or maybe some of them will be answered in the content as we progress through the webinar. So again, welcome to folks. My name is Lindsay Robinson from the California Cannabis Industry Association, and this is our federal webinar with our friends from the liaison group. So welcome, everyone. We're really happy to have you. Again, use the chat function if you have any questions, and we'll get to Q&A at the end. You're probably going to get tired of me saying that, but I want to remind folks, because we do want this to be interactive and have folks weigh in on with their questions. So a couple of things I want to just talk a little bit about before we get started. Hopefully all of you CCIA members are receiving the ongoing communications from CCIA. We are striving to keep you updated on all of the information that we're hearing across the state, and certainly from the Capitol. The legislature is currently not in session and is slated to return in early May right now, but that could definitely change. But really our goal with our emails and our communication to all of you is we are trying to streamline the amount of information we're putting out, because we know that most folks, their inboxes are quite full with COVID information and what that means for their businesses. So CCIA is really striving to make sure that we are demonstrating strong leadership in this space and helping you decipher what that information means. As part of our ongoing communications, we have put together a COVID resource page. Hopefully many of you have visited the page on our website, and that information has been helpful to you. If you have things that your company is doing that you don't see listed that you would like to share, we would love to see them, right? So go ahead and send those to me or to Justin or Josh, and we'll help get that information out there to members. We're also doing a webinar series. We've been hosting a weekly webinar on Wednesdays. I think this is our fourth. All of the webinars are up on our website within 2 days after they're filmed live as a resource for our members. So do check out the webinars. And yeah, we're excited to put out some really special announcements regarding 420. So stay tuned for those updates at the end of the week. But we really want to stress making sure that people are staying at home, sheltering in place, and making sure that they're compliant for the safety and health of their workers as well as customers. So we know that folks are going to want to gather on 420 as we traditionally do in this industry, but we really want to make sure that we as an industry are putting out responsible messaging around public gathering and 420. So stay tuned for more updates on that. If you're joining us today and you're not a member of CCIA, we would love to have you join. You can reach out to Justin in the membership department if you have any questions or interest in joining, or if you have any questions about your current membership, if you're already a member. We are solely funded by our member dues. We know that a lot of companies are struggling right now in the industry, but we want to be a continuing resource for all of you. So we hope, if you're not a member, that you'll consider joining to help us be able to put together great content like this. So without further ado, for the folks who are just joining, we are going to host a Q&A at the end of the webinar. So please send any questions you have through the chat function. I will try to get to them as many as I can, and then I'll also try to combine the ones that seem most relevant. So let's kick it off. Enough intro. We are really excited to have our guests from the liaison group with us today. Safira Galoub is the principal and CEO and also serves as the Senior Public Policy Advisor and Executive Director of the National Cannabis Roundtable. And Safira helps head CCIA's federal policy advisors. She has worked for 2 decades as a lawyer, a lobbyist, and an entrepreneur, and she founded the Liaison Group in 2016. Currently, the Liaison Group is the only Washington-based lobbying firm focused exclusively on the cannabis industry. We also have David Mangone with us today. David serves as the Director of Policy and Government Affairs, and prior to joining the Liaison Group, David served as the Director of Government Affairs and Counsel for Americans for Safe Access. So we are really excited to have both of you with us today. Oh, and how funny that we're all above our photos. If you guys notice, my bangs they've not made the cut through the self-quarantining here, folks. So you'll just have to deal with it. Anyways, okay, let's kick it off. So I have a list of questions here, and I think we're gonna start off with Safira. So I would love for you to describe a little bit about how CCIA had been engaged with Washington over the last 18 months and what we've accomplished to help kind of set the landscape here.
First, Lindsay, thank you so much for having us today and for being not just a continued voice for your California industry stakeholders, but for presenting such leadership and such measured and thoughtful presence amongst all the state associations. I can tell you I work with a lot of state associations, and they will frequently, if not always, ask me, where is California on this? And so if you within California don't realize you really are looked upon for thoughtfulness and comprehensive decision making, and not just from the rest of the country, but from the industry as a whole. So really happy to give you an update, and actually quite pleased to tell you that CCIA's work over the past year and a half is starting to show why we made the investments, why we developed the relationship base in DC. As many of you may have heard us present over the past 3 or 4 Sacramento-based conferences, the Federal Policy Advisors is a group that works with the Board of Directors at CCIA and travels to Washington, D.C. many times a year, sometimes, depending on the year or the month. It can be anywhere between 6, 7 times a year. And the objective is to engage with the California congressional delegation. 55 members represent your great industry and your great state, and they have an outsized voice in Congress and in Washington. And our goal has been to both educate them on the priorities of the California Cannabis Industry Association and help them to focus, prioritize, and target their influence and political will and push to speak for the main objectives and priorities of CCIA. So today, we are in a position to activate that investment and to direct the priorities of Congress to help the industry as it deserves and demands.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'm just trying to move some stuff around here. All right, thanks for being patient. So before we get into where we are going, I'd like to ask David to give us an overview of the last 3 stimulus packages so we can have some clarity on the current lay of the land and what we have passed to date.
Sure, and Lindsay, I'd love to echo what Safira said. Really happy to be a part of this webinar and to be talking about the work we're doing a bit differently, though nonetheless consistently on Capitol Hill. Many of our meetings that we usually do face-to-face have moved to either Zooms or teleconferences. So the challenges of pushing policy in a technological-only world has become very apparent throughout these packages. So before talking about these in detail, something remarkable about the first 3 stimulus packages is how quickly they came together. I think Washington is well known for its partisan gridlock and its long-term delays in getting policy moved forward. Close to $2.5 trillion worth of aid was pulled together between March 6th and the 1st of April. So looking at that, short timeline compared to what we see with the committee process and the markup process, it's really astonishing how quickly this was pulled together. So the first package was the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Supplemental Appropriations. Certainly a mouthful, but the goal of this first package was to provide immediate aid to healthcare organizations and agencies under the federal government. So this included funding for the CDC, the FDA, National Institutes of Health, USAID, and the Small Business Administration. Much of the funding was dedicated to making tests for COVID-19 more available, as well as $1 billion in funding for SBA small businesses. We'll get to package 2 and 3 in a moment, but as I'm sure many of you have already come to realize, there's difficulties and challenges in having cannabis businesses that both touch the plant and do not touch the plant applying for these funding packages. Package 2 was known as the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. This bill included free testing for uninsured, had a requirement that businesses would be paying sick leave. It breaks it down between employees, businesses that employ either more than 50 employees, up to 500, over 500 employees, or less than 50 employees. For 51 and more employees, this requirement for paid sick leave is required of all businesses. However, businesses under 50 employees may be exempt from this requirement if they can show to the SBA administrator that paying this sick leave would jeopardize the viability of their business. We haven't seen exactly how this will play out yet with the under 50 employee requirement. Certainly getting the SBA administrator to discretionarily say, I think is going to require the submission of financial records and revenue statements. And it seems as though there may be a challenge for any business that's been allowed to remain operational during this time to show the viability of the business as a going concern, especially compared to businesses that have had to shut down their operations entirely. So other features of phase 2 included expansion of funds for Medicaid and food security programs like the SNAP and temporary assistance program, and then it also expanded access to unemployment benefits. The penultimate package to where we are right now was the largest package. It was about $2 trillion worth of assistance. This is the package that included individual stimulus paychecks. These have already apparently begun to be distributed to people who filed 2018 and 2019 tax returns. And it additionally includes the Paycheck Protection Program for businesses to cover payroll expenses, group healthcare, employee salaries, and other financial obligations. Unfortunately, with how these loans are set up through the Paycheck Protection Program, they typically require a traditional depository institution or credit union to issue these loans. And as you all know, with the ongoing challenges to lack of access to banking, having access to these traditional lenders to obtain the PPP loans is not something that's readily available to many people on this call, I would imagine. Other elements of the phase 3 package included emergency disaster relief. This was the Small Business Administration issuing another set of funding that said if you had shut down your operation or had been forced to continue operations, you'd be eligible for certain grants administered through the SBA. Unfortunately, the SBA administrator went out of their way to say that these SBA loans are not available for any business that engages in illegal commerce. They define illegal as illegal under federal or state law. As they further explained, we had to dig a little bit for this guidance. Guidance from 2018 and 2019 from the Small Business Administration give further detail about direct versus indirect cannabis businesses. Direct is fairly straightforward. It's your cultivators, your retailers, dispensaries, manufacturing facilities. Indirect is a little bit less clear. It includes things like law firms, accounting firms, perhaps packaging companies. And unfortunately, the difference between the two doesn't matter a whole lot in the eyes of the SBA. Even indirect businesses, they say that any business that derives any, and that the any is in italics in the guidance, any revenue from a cannabis business will be ineligible for the SBA loans. So right here is the quote from the interim final rule. Financial transactions involving a marijuana-related business would generally involve funds derived from illegal activity. The guidance goes on to say that because of this, these businesses will be ineligible. So that is where we have been. And I would like to pass it back to Lindsay or Safira to add into that overview of the current packages.
Safira, would you like to add on?
Well, I think, David, as usual, you always give not just a detailed and comprehensive, but a very clear explanation of where we are today. And I want to take a moment for those of you in the audience, if the unfairness of treatment of cannabis felt burdensome before, we are poignantly aware of how businesses are kind of stuck with the burdens of federal law without the benefits of federal law. And this is where we find ourselves today. So if you're wondering how much fire we feel lit underneath our efforts, I can tell you that we are positioned and postured to address this gross divide in a way that we never have been before. And much like that fateful January 4th day when Jeff Sessions rescinded those memos, the impetus for and the kind of the catalyst for addressing and advancing our policies has never been better in terms of where the cannabis businesses sit as the potential and likely economic engine, not that could, but that will. And so we are balancing this reality that the pandemic has impacted the businesses in our industry in the same way it's impacted businesses across our country and our globe. Many businesses are allowed to remain open, nevertheless burdened by the lack of level playing field. But we, unlike other industries and unlike other businesses, we're positioned to be a part of the solution while we are demanding corrections for the injustices based on these last three packages. So I just set that up as a transition and a pivotal point for you to understand where this positions us.
Great, thank you, Safira. I'm sure we will talk more about that as the webinar goes on. We've heard about a fourth stimulus package. Can you describe the overall political climate in which that's being negotiated currently?
Sure. Actually, there's an interim funding initiative to put more money in three. We're calling it 3.5. We're not calling that the fourth package because it's really just a change in the amount of money allocated. For those of you who are attentive towards and have some information about the fact that our industry, specifically the medical cannabis industry stakeholders, have protection under the appropriations laws, I want you to know that the bills that are advancing through Congress are part of that appropriations legislative vehicle as well as authorization. So when we talk about changing laws, we talk about spending bills, which happen every year, and we talk about authorization laws, which is changing federal statute. The safe banking law, for example, is an authorization law. The Rohrabacher language, as you all may remember, we now call it Joyce-Blumenauer, is an appropriations. And so these upcoming bills are hybrid. They're hybrid of those two types of bills. In the upcoming package, we're calling it Stimulus 4. We are expecting the original draft to come out of the House, which means that Speaker Pelosi will be drafting. We know that and have learned that our great champion of the Safe Banking Act, Ed Perlmutter from Colorado, has been in contact not just with the Speaker, but in conversation with the whole Democratic caucus. and has obtained publicly and pointedly a commitment by Speaker Pelosi to advance cannabis reform in one of the next packages. Now, I just want to be clear, I said in one of the next packages, meaning we're expecting package 4, which has already been in the press and you've heard about it, and there's drafting around it. There also may likely be a package 5 and 6. But of course, as these packages sit within a broader political dynamic between R's and D's, between Republicans and Democrats, we want to get in an earlier package just in the event that a later package gets stalled between partisan politics. I'm going to let David speak a little bit more on some of the efforts in the package, but in addition to advancing safe banking, as many of you probably have read in our trades, there is a significant push and a momentum and traction developed to access those safe banking loans. Senator Rosen initiated a letter in the Senate. We have a broad bipartisan support, dear colleague letter coming out from Congressman Blumenauer that our team is in the process of, we call whipping, getting signatures for. But likely the language that will be advanced by Speaker Pelosi will have a combination of safe banking and SBA. We have not seen it, but we have heard rumblings and have been asked to advise on that text. David, I'm gonna pass it to you to make sure I haven't missed anything, or if more clarity or precision is required in our description.
Sure, and as I mentioned with the first 3 packages and how quickly they came together, package 4 is certainly going to have a significant more amount of negotiation and debate compared to the first 3 packages. The first 3, in a large sense, were viewed as an immediate emergency response, and package 4 is being viewed as a recovery package. So it doesn't address necessarily some of the public health matters that were addressed in the first 3. So knowing that, and knowing that the House and Senate aren't expected to return to May 4th, there is time for negotiation back and forth on this package as it develops. So with current efforts on that front right now, as Safira mentioned, Pelosi has expressed interest in providing relief for cannabis businesses in an upcoming package. This came to light via a town hall that Ed Perlmutter had conducted. And he had shared with the participants of that town hall that he had spoken directly with the speaker about this issue, and that she was very receptive to resolving the issue on behalf of her constituents in California, as well as cannabis businesses around the country. At a previous meeting between representatives of CCIA and the liaison group, we approached Speaker Pelosi with some of these issues, particularly more focused on safe banking, and their staff had indicated to us that cannabis hadn't been a priority in past negotiations with things like appropriations because no one had directly brought it to her attention, whether that was members, whether that was individual companies. It just not had become a priority for her in previous appropriations negotiations. There's certainly a narrative now, largely because of the coronavirus, that has thrust cannabis businesses into the attention of news media, discussing how their operations are proceeding, the struggles that they are facing, as well as the challenges that remaining an essential business while continuing to be illegal under federal law has presented for these businesses. So in response to that, members of both the House and Senate have highlighted the importance of access to SBA loans. The first is a letter from Senator Rosen from Nevada. She was joined by 10 other senators, including Senator Kamala Harris, asking for the appropriators for the Small Business Administration to prevent the SBA from withholding grants and loans to cannabis businesses solely because of their federal illegality. So this letter was well received by the Senate, and having 11 senators agree on a letter was certainly significant. As a more I think interim effort, because that is related to general appropriations. Congressman Blumenauer from Oregon has been circulating a small business letter that he expects to send to leadership by the end of this week, have explaining the same principles that cannabis businesses should be eligible for these small business grants, for these small business loans, because of their important role in both Oregon and the national economy. The signatures will be collected and finalized by the end of this week, but it has already seemed to generate a fairly positive response amongst the Democratic caucus, as well as some Republicans have already committed to join on as well. Beyond that, there is interest from Senate Republicans in exploring the idea for indirect cannabis businesses to access loans independent of a larger conversation about direct businesses. There hasn't been any legislative text proposed on this issue yet, but members certainly understand and appreciate that even if they may not be supportive of the cannabis industry, they recognize that there are businesses in their district, gardening companies, law firms that may be jeopardized in their revenue because of the guidance that the SBA issued relating to any gross revenue from a cannabis business. So that is where we are. It's encouraging to see the conversations happen around these issues. Members are interested in talking about this issue, both from the safe banking side and the small business relief side. And certainly seeing multiple congressional letters circulating right now is encouraging for our efforts and the work that we are doing.
Great, thank you for that, David. That was super informative. So let's kind of head back to the potential fourth package and talk a little bit about support on the House side versus the Senate side, and how we might formulate our expectations around those dynamics.
And I'd like to, in terms of formulating expectations, I actually want to insert, because the question that I think that viewers should have at this moment is, so what is CCIA doing now to activate, advance, and support the House effort? And I want to give an overview of that so you as members understand that your investments, while primarily focused on the work at the state level, have developed a base and a framework and a policy, a process to advance your voice on the federal level. So over the past—
Safira, before you start, I just want to remind people really quickly, we will have Q&A at the end. Please send in questions via the chat function, and we'll try to get to them once we go into the Q&A. But if things pop up along the way, I write them down or send them in, and we'll address them. Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead, Safira.
And we're coming to the end. We really wanted just to, as I finish up, we really are going to leave a lot of time for questions. So we'll be just finishing our remarks shortly. So the California Cannabis Industry Association has led an initiative to ask the California Congressional Caucus, so the House members from California, to jointly convey to Speaker Pelosi that cannabis reform is the time must be now. And, while we have clearly received not just authentic, but heartfelt support from the California delegation on a member-by-member basis, having the delegation jointly sign on to a letter that conveys to Speaker Pelosi that addressing cannabis banking and addressing SBA loans have to be one of her top priorities, not just in her bag of concerns, that's a game changer. We are thrilled that Congresswoman Katie Porter, who is both on the Financial Services Committee, but also really a highly respected member of the delegation, joined by a couple of other key congressional staff whose names I won't mention today because we're still waiting for a couple of I's to dot and T's to cross, but we're leading an intra-delegation letter to communicate to Ms. Pelosi that in fact her delegation is asking her directly for help on this issue. And that is a big play, and there's nobody else in the country, there's no other association, there's no other group that could make this ask and make this gesture and deliver this gesture to the speaker on behalf of your industry in your state.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that and concur. I think the 18 months that we have spent working with the liaison group has positioned our organization to step up to the plate at this point, and pushing on from kind of multiple angles for comprehensive banking. And CCIA, and I'll talk a little bit about this maybe when we wrap up, is the efforts that we've been doing at the state level to also help kind of support the broader federal push that we're making now. So maybe hop into the dynamics between the House and the Senate leadership and where you think our major pain points are going to be.
Yeah. Do you want me to start, David, or do you want? I'll start and I'll pass to you if you want. Okay.
You can go ahead and start.
Yeah. So we know and we have seen that on the House side, we have broad bipartisan support for safe banking. We had 91 Republicans vote in favor of the safe banking bill. Every Democrat voted in favor of the bill but one. We moved it out of the House. It is currently in the Senate. The work in the House has been successful and is really ready for the Senate to take action. As a reminder, on the Senate side, and if you guys hearken back to how legislation is passed, you don't just get a win on one side, you've got to get a win on both sides of the Capitol. Chairman Mike Crapo, who is from Idaho, the great state of Idaho, where no form of cannabis, there's no legality. It's one of 3 states where there's no legality around cannabis, is the gatekeeper for safe banking. And while we have seen him engage with industry and acknowledge the necessity to address the issue, we've been waiting for him to address and introduce a bill. David and I have directly been involved in drafting for his staff and have, there is actually a completed draft, we'll call it the Crapo banking draft, that is on his desk. So there has been momentum and movement, but in terms of Crapo introducing a bill, we haven't seen that. And because Leader McConnell it embraces cannabis through hemp only and is still very, not just reluctant, but he's skittish about addressing cannabis, we really don't have a climate with the Republicans on the Senate side, besides Senator Gardner, besides Senator Kramer from North Dakota, Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, Senator Daines. We don't have Senate Republicans in the number that we need to move on a bill easily. Now, that doesn't mean to say we won't move on the bill, because if the bill is in a larger package and it makes more sense to vote for the whole package, then we've got movement. But we still are, there's a very asymmetrical amount of support on the Senate side and the House side, and that is a reality that we have to reconcile. And it's why we at CCIA have been so adamant about prioritizing and staying focused, because when you have such asymmetrical politics in Washington, giving them too many things to think about doesn't make your life easier. It doesn't make your work more efficient. Giving them clear, concise, and consistent direction, banking, 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 is what will get them to banking, as opposed to all of the things we need solved. So David, with that, I'll pass it to you and see where I may have missed and where there may need more specificity.
Sure. I think with particularly Senate leadership, we're in a interesting position. Senator Gardner, who's our biggest champion, is up for re-election in 2020, but as is Leader McConnell. They certainly, I think from Senator McConnell's perspective, wants to help Senator Gardner with a victory related to cannabis so he can bring that back to his voters in Colorado. That being said, Mitch McConnell is also, I think, very aware of his own election. While he's polling better to his opponent compared to Senator Gardner, it's still a concern that I think he is worried about hearing from groups like Kentucky law enforcement and some of his more conservative evangelical voters who may be dissatisfied with him moving a proposal like that forward. That all being said, it is much more likely for us to get the relief that we're looking for in one of these larger stimulus packages than it ever would be to have one of these bills move on their own through either chamber. Bills that aren't attached to larger vehicles haven't been overall successful, regardless of the issue over the last several years. There was certainly some movement with the MORE Act, as well as the Safe Banking Act, and the discussions that we ended up having were that, particularly with the Safe Banking Act, it would be attached to a larger legislative vehicle like an appropriations package. So the fact that we now have a proverbial several bites at the apple with these rolling stimulus packages provides us more vehicles to attach something to than we may have otherwise had in a regular year, where the only larger legislative vehicle moving may be an appropriations mechanism.
That's a great point, David.
Great, thank you for that. Well, we're going to maybe wrap this up in, I don't know, 3 to 5 minutes so we can take some time for questions. I see a few have come through. If folks want to go ahead and use your chat function, excuse me, to enter a question in, we'll try to get to as many as we can. Any thoughts from either of you just on kind of next steps or anything we might not have covered in the questions? I'll talk a little bit about what CCIA, our recent efforts on the state side and how they're, coinciding with this federal push.
So, Lindsay, I think the one thing that we want to be mindful of as we're advancing this intra-delegation letter is, ideally, we would like for every member of the California delegation to sign on. And so we'll be reaching out to all of them once we get our co-leads supporting Congresswoman Porter. But as we go through the offices and we'll say, please sign on the letter, we may be reaching out to individual California businesses who are located in those respective districts. And we'll be asking those members, we'll provide the text, we'll staff the text to reach out to that office and say, we know you've been asked to sign this letter, please sign this letter because, and then the liaison group will circle around. It's a little bit like an ask sandwich. We'll let the office know that they'd like to sign the letter. We'll have the constituents say, we know you've been asked, and then we'll circle back around and say, we know you've been asked, please sign the letter. Because the more signatures we can get on that letter, the stronger the message is to the speaker that her including this in the base text of her bill is the utmost priority, not just a priority of many, but one of the top priorities.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. I do want to let folks know that CCIA did submit a letter to the Newsom administration about 2 weeks ago, asking for a few different strategic, questions or asks. And we outlined them. Certainly, number one was including cannabis businesses in statewide stimulus packages. All kind of leading back to the fact that we have issues with banking. We're currently cut out of almost entirely out of federal support. And so the state ideally would help, step in to support these businesses, reiterating that right now, legal businesses are numbered 4 to 1 by the illicit market in California. And the pandemic is currently compounding all of the issues that we're already facing in the state. And we continue to have weekly conversations with the administration around the asks that we addressed in that letter. And then I won't go through all of the asks just for the sake of time, because I want to be able to answer these questions. But we did close the letter with an official ask to the governor to help with the efforts in regarding Speaker Pelosi and making sure that they are fully aware of the role that cannabis businesses play in the economy and the direct hindrance we have from lack of banking. So oftentimes, the small credit unions that are willing to work with the industry, they don't offer SBA loans. And so in order to get in the queue, if you're, even an ancillary business, it's incredibly difficult if your banking services, are already really limited. So we could go on for hours about that difficult dynamic, but I did want to hop over to some questions here. I'm going to encourage folks to go ahead and use the chat portal. And let's see, I'm going to try to get these in. So we've got a couple that are dealing here, questions that are dealing just with state stuff. I'll try to weave those in at the end, but I do want to kind of stick to federal. We have a question here. Does the same dynamic exist in the stimulus package 4 between SAFE and the descheduling efforts of MPP? Are you familiar with those efforts, and are you able to speak to those at all?
Yes. So as many of you who've been following the federal conversation around cannabis reform, the way that we describe it when we talk about it is there are two buckets of cannabis reform. There's the legalization bucket, and then there is the bucket of legislation that addresses, because cannabis is illegal. Familiar with the legalization push, I can tell you that how both, even within the House, amongst Democrats, how legalization should happen and what that legislation should and will look like still has to be worked out, still has to be reconciled. Even though the MORE Act is obviously the leading piece of legislation, it hasn't been entirely vetted through the committees of jurisdiction that have to consider it. And so because there is still significant work on that piece of legislation, it is politically not ripe yet to come into the speaker's purview. And I know that doesn't feel right for you guys, but political process is an issue here. We've got to respect political process. Safe banking came out of the House with 2/3 vote in favor. It has achieved its comprehensive bipartisan support. It has gone through the vetting. And as a reminder for folks in the hall, on the call, safe banking has been in play specifically for 7 years. Whereas the MORE Act was just introduced this year. And I'm not saying that that means it shouldn't push. I'm just saying that there's additional considerations by chairmen of committees of jurisdictions that I think impact the viability for it to be included in a stimulus package. David?
Yeah, what I'll add is from the members that we've talked to, they are looking for things that have a direct nexus to the pandemic. And with a lot of the issues that are perceived to come with a legalization bill, those predate the pandemic. And a great example is the 280E tax provision. We've heard from members that this is an issue that existed outside of the crisis. It's not something that necessarily finds its way in. The flip side is with safe banking, they see the direct connection between limiting in-person transactions, removing contaminated cash from stores, and certainly with the SBA relief, they see that the pandemic has directly affected these businesses and their ability to remain operational. So I think with some of the larger issues that would be addressed with perhaps a more comprehensive legalization bill, those issues are not because of the pandemic, but perhaps they are amplified because of the pandemic. But certainly with some of the economic bills, the SBA relief, the safe banking bill, and there's also been talk of prison crowding bills, releasing nonviolent drug offenders. They all, I think, clearly are looking for that connection that directly relates to public health in the terms of COVID-19. So certainly with the MORE Act, as Safira mentioned, it still has not been vetted by several committees. They're looking for solutions that they don't have to do a lot of legislative lifting on. And certainly the safe banking has already been proposed. The SBA framework is, realistically, it's striking a sentence from SBA guidance. It doesn't require a whole lot of infrastructure to be put in place. So they're looking for straightforward solutions that have that direct nexus. So that's what I would add.
Great, thank you for that. I know that you both are in regular contact with a lot of the other organizations and trade groups that work in DC. So I do want to point out that there is strong communication between the groups, and ideally no one is working in a silo, because it's important, just like it is on the state level, to to know who your allies are and to work together as much as possible. So I do appreciate that effort with both of you. And I was wondering if you've heard at all, like, have the Association for Bankers or credit unions weighed in on this issue yet?
We've been in contact. So the liaison group, as Lindsay mentioned at the top of the call, directs the policy work for the National Cannabis Roundtable. And the National Cannabis Roundtable was a leading organization to coalesce ancillary industries that are impacted by the lack of banking, but are not cannabis industry stakeholders. Think the ABA, CUNA, credit unions, the realtors, the insurance folks, shopping centers. And we've been working with them for about a year. They are absolutely aware of this concern and effort. The day, actually, I think it was the Thursday before we all went in quarantine, David and I joined 9 of those industry associations in a meeting with Senator Crapo's staff and with Senator Brown's staff, not just to say, Senate banking staff, have we answered all your questions, but to say collectively, addressing cannabis banking is a priority for our industries. And so we have them engaged, we have them corralled, we have them engaged, we have them communicating. And so that has been having these messengers outside of the cannabis industry to carry our water and communicate our message, particularly to those senators who are more reluctant to be cannabis supporters. They're more likely to listen to the bankers and the realtors and the insurance folks than us if they're cannabis skittish. That those are in play and in motion and helping us where they can.
Great, thank you. A couple kind of more specific questions here. Let me. So for ancillary or indirect businesses, does it make sense for them to still apply for the PPP and the EIDL? I know you don't want to give legal advice or head into that territory, but would you just encourage people to try to get in the queue?
Yeah, certainly want to highlight that disclaimer. Although Safira and I are both lawyers, this is not legal advice. Please check with your in-house or attorney who's barred in California. I think between Safira and I, our bars do not include California. I am South Carolina and DC. I know Safira has Oklahoma and DC. But again, even if we were licensed in California, I would still encourage you to get advice from your own counsel. But I think there is a valid strategy in applying for these loans, if for nothing else, for a PR piece. Being able to show the denial of these loans. Obviously, it is a challenging situation that with the ongoing federal rules and federal illegality, certainly wouldn't want any of your businesses to be put in jeopardy by raising a flag that you are having to expose your revenues to anyone other than the IRS. But there may be some value, particularly in the Paycheck Protection Program, that's discretionary, and seeing if the administrator is willing to make an opinion on this. Safira?
I think that's right. And then I'll also say, we didn't talk about block grants, but there is some movement and some discussions that some of these federal packages may actually be allocating state block grants that are not designated towards an agency, but are designated to a state to disperse at its discretion. And I think that actually may be an outlet. We're still kind of trying to parse through what's been passed and where there may be momentum, but we may be able to leverage that. And in California, that may be a possibility, as in other states that have comprehensive legal programs.
Great, thank you for that. We've had a few kind of similar questions regarding what individuals or businesses can do to help support this effort. So one was a little bit more specific in terms of they've previously met with Member McCarty on healthcare reform issues, and they're wondering if, you know, a letter from an indirect or typically conservative insurance firm might be helpful. Is there any, what do we think about next steps so that, you know, we can focus on action for our members?
Yeah, I think two things. I think direct contact, particularly on an issue like that, is so important. Members don't know to prioritize these issues if they don't hear from constituents about it. Safira and I can talk about, you know, these issues all day long, but it is 1,000 times more effective for a business in a representative's district to show how this crisis has impacted job numbers, how this crisis has impacted their ability to give back to the community. Those are the stories that make the difference. Those are the stories that appear in floor speeches when representatives are, you know, arguing for the support of these amendments. So I think that is critically important to share those types of stories. We are happy to facilitate them to help them get into the right hands, but we can't describe how your business works and how your business operates in any way that you can. So having those stories shared, I think, is really important. And the second, I think, is there is this ongoing narrative that we are combating against, that all cannabis businesses right now, because they've been able to be essential, saw a spike in revenue because of this crisis, that they are rolling in cash and don't need additional assistance. And well, I think there was a number of businesses that saw a brief spike in the middle of March in terms of their overall sales. We all know that the case of sustained increased revenue is not the reality that your businesses are facing. So being able to make that distinction and then bringing those personal stories, I think, is incredibly important.
I do want to, though, I do want to highlight the importance of knowing your congressional audience. So in this scenario, we've got Leader McCarthy, and we've got a potential constituent from the insurance industry. What I would prefer is if we know that we've got a messenger, which is the insurer, that we as the folks advising CCIA help craft the message. Because for Leader McCarthy, I would say we are an economic engine. We just need our shackles released. We are a linchpin for economic growth. We just need access to level playing field. We are a solution for healing the economy. We just need the treatment that other businesses in our state get, as opposed to saying, we insurers, please give us SBA money. Now, I'm not saying we can't ask for that, but there's a message prioritization. This is about being pragmatic, frankly, and about really understanding your audience and where they are politically in our issue, and being very pointed and targeted towards what would be most effective for them. So this is where I say, everybody on the call, leverage what David and I do for the organization. Leverage your investment to maximize the effectiveness of your message and your relationship assets.
Yeah, and maybe we could even explore having a couple templates available to members with, crafted language that we think could be helpful. And also, too, the individual who wrote this question is very involved in CCIA and our committees, including our risk management committee, which focuses on insurance, HR, intellectual property, and we've done a number of webinars with folks from that committee, and I think we're going to be doing another one very soon, talking a lot about the what David was just addressing with the sort of retail myth about how well the industry is doing. And so, Deirdre, we can definitely stay in touch with you on that piece. But for other folks too, it might be helpful for us to think about some templates, because you're absolutely right, and we're seeing that play out on the state level too. Certainly right now, cannabis businesses are deemed essential, but there have been some issues locally where the health departments are kind of overriding that. And so we're seeing, medical only designations for some businesses being allowed to stay open, and obviously some severe restriction with delivery and curbside only. And what we've seen be incredibly effective is when the local businesses are doing outreach to, their board of supervisors and the health department and such. So we can't stress enough that having that voice of their constituent is what really rings true for a lot of the delegates that we're doing outreach to. So let's see, we're getting close to the end here. I think we've kind of addressed almost all of the questions. Anything final, folks? Send it in now. I do want to remind folks that CCIA, if you haven't already looked, we have a really robust COVID-19 resource page. If you have information that you would like us to share with our members regarding best practices that you all have been working on at your companies, we would be happy to do that. Also, we're happy to advertise webinars and educational events that you are doing. We want to make sure that our community feels as educated as possible. And we're trying to trim out a lot of the noise that's happening, because we know that folks are really bombarded with information. So we're trying to distill that down to the most useful. useful info that we can get you all. I do want to give a big shout out to Justin McCarthy and Josh Straighton from CCIA, who've been working their butts off to keep open lines of communication with membership, and Josh churning out, all of our content for communications. It's been, they have been invaluable. I know we have a lot on our plate right now. We are preparing for the legislature to come back. It is going to be a drastically different landscape in California in terms of what the legislative process is potentially going to look like over the next few months. So do just want folks to stay in touch with CCIA. Reach out to us. We are your member organization. We work for you. We hope that you're able to still financially help support the organization during this really difficult time. But we're also open to working with all of you on member dues. So if you have issues, please reach out to us. And let us know how you're doing. We miss all of you. And webinars are the only way we see people these days. So this is it. Okay, any final thoughts from either of you before we wrap up?
David, why don't you start?
Sure. This is going to be an ongoing process. We are here to give updates, but appreciate you all taking the time out of your day to listen what's going on in Washington, and very much appreciate the work that you all do in California to maintain this industry as one that can thrive and survive through even the worst times. So Safira, with that, I will give you the final word.
So we have always looked to California as a beacon for thought leadership politically, as a hopefulness towards the way that medicine can be redefined with cannabis and cannabis communities, and certainly as the future of the cannabis industry, not just globally, but really for the future of personal health and humanity. And this is a time when we're tested beyond limits that we ever imagined. We have to stay measured, focused, and clear-headed and clear-worded, meaning this is the time that we work more closely and more collaboratively and more concisely than any other time in the history of our industry and maybe in the history of our lives. And we will find progress as long as we continue to be disciplined and work together, and to make sure that as we move forward and as our team moves forward for you, that you have all the information that you deserve, demand, and need to help us help your industry and help the livelihoods and lives that you've already demonstrated to. And with that, I'll pass it back to you, Lindsay, and say thank you for the honor and the opportunity to represent this industry and this state. It is really, it is the highlight of what David and I do on the Hill, I can assure you.
Well, I love that. That is a great note to end on. So for all you CCIA members, just know that you're being well represented in DC and in Sacramento. Hopefully, maybe we can bring you back in a couple weeks and we'll have more exciting news to share. That's the plan.
Hopefully, good news.
So yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. Again, all of these weekly webinars are up on our website. Please use them as a resource. We're going to be hosting another one next week, so stay tuned for that. Very, very grateful to Safira and David for sharing your extensive knowledge and for working real hard for us in DC. We'll talk to you all very soon.
Thanks,
Thank you so much, folks.
Bye.